You stopped me because I'm walking to my gate. That's all I'm doing.
Ma'am, we received a report. I'm asking for your ID.
A report of what? Existing while black? I'm not handing anything over until you tell me why you're really here.
We're just trying to verify
and I'm
some
trying to make
information.
At cinci patruzeci și șapte a.m., inside Reagan National Airport. The terminal was nearly empty, wrapped in that quiet, colorless calm that only exists before the day truly begins. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across polished floors still damp from the overnight cleaning crew. A handful of early travelers moved toward security with slow, practiced steps, coffee cups warming their hands, faces heavy with sleep. The checkpoint machines beeped in a steady, almost comforting rhythm. Nothing about the morning suggested anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. Nothing that would later be replayed on national news or dissected in courtrooms across the country. Through the terminal walked a black woman in her early 50s, calm and composed, her posture straight, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, pressed to perfection, and pulled a small carry-on behind her with the ease of someone who had done this walk countless times. There was no hesitation in her stride. No need to look around for direction. She belonged in this space, and she moved like someone who knew it. This was Judge Vivian Hartwell, a sitting federal appeals court judge on the Fourth Circuit, appointed by the President of the United States after a unanimous Senate confirmation just 3 years earlier. Before taking the bench, she had spent nearly 2 decades as a federal prosecutor, handling some of the most complex and dangerous cases in the system, putting cartel leaders, violent offenders, and corrupt officials behind bars. That morning, Judge Hartwell was traveling to Chicago to deliver the keynote address at the National Judicial Conference, where she was scheduled to speak on civil rights, judicial integrity, and the responsibility of the justice system to treat every person equally under the law. Her credentials were impeccable. Her reputation was beyond question. She had built her entire life around the belief that justice was not selective, that the law applied to everyone, regardless of race, status, or power. As she made her way toward her gate, she had no way of knowing that in less than 12 minutes, everything she believed in, everything she represented, would be violently tested by the very system she had spent her life serving. Across the terminal, near the security checkpoint, Officer Bryce Kesler stood with his arms folded across his chest, scanning the early morning crowd with a practiced, almost predatory patience. At 44 years old, stocky, with a shaved head and a permanent scowl etched into his face, Kesler carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed this space belonged to him. 16 years with the Reagan National Airport Police Department had taught him a single, enduring lesson on this side of the badge. Power came from control, and control came from knowing how to write the story afterward. As long as the report used the right words evasive, uncooperative, matched a description, everything else could be justified. His personnel file told a story no passenger ever saw. 31 complaints filed over 14 years, racial profiling, excessive force, intimidation, harassment. Every one of them reviewed. Every one of them dismissed. Witnesses changed their statements. Complainants stopped returning calls. Internal Affairs stamped the files with familiar phrases unsubstantiated, insufficient evidence, and buried them where they would never surface again. Kesler had learned to trust the system, not because it was fair, but because it protected its own. Among his colleagues, some called him old school, the kind of cop who didn't take nonsense. Others quietly requested transfers after a few shifts working beside him, sensing the volatility beneath his calm exterior. That morning, his partner was Officer Danny Stokes, 29 years old. 5 years into the job. Tall and lean with the restless energy of someone still trying to prove himself. Stokes laughed at Kesler's jokes, echoed his opinions, and never questioned his decisions. When Kesler shifted his weight, Stokes adjusted with him. When Kesler's eyes locked onto someone, Stokes followed his gaze without hesitation. As Judge Vivian Hartwell moved confidently through the terminal in her charcoal suit, Kesler noticed her immediately. The way she walked, the way she held her head high, the way she didn't avert her eyes or shrink into the background. Something about her confidence irritated him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He nudged Stokes with his elbow and nodded subtly in her direction. "Watch this one," he said quietly, already deciding that this ordinary morning was about to become something else entirely. Judge Hartwell had already cleared the security checkpoint and was making her way toward Gate 23 when a sharp voice cut through the quiet hum of the terminal behind her. "Ma'am, stop right there." The words carried the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. She stopped immediately and turned, her carry-on coming to rest beside her as she faced the 2 airport police officers approaching her. One was older, stock-here, with a shaved head and a hard expression. The other trailed half a step behind, younger, alert, already positioning himself slightly to the side. "Is there a problem?" Officer Judge Hartwell asked. Her voice was calm, measured, the same tone she used in her courtroom when tempers flared and lawyers pushed too far. Officer Bryce Kesler stepped closer than necessary, his eyes moving slowly over her suit, her jewelry, the confident way she stood her ground. His hand rested casually on his duty belt, fingers hovering just inches from his weapon. "You match a description," he said. "We had a theft reported earlier this morning." Her expression didn't change. "I'm a federal judge with the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals," she replied evenly. "I'm traveling on official judicial business, and I've already cleared security. I'm heading to my gate." Kesler's lips curled into a faint smirk, the kind that suggested he had heard every excuse imaginable and enjoyed dismissing them all. "Sure you are," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. Behind him, Officer Danny Stokes subtly shifted his stance, closing off the direct path toward the gate. A businessman nearby slowed his pace, curiosity pulling his attention from his phone. A woman at a coffee kiosk glanced up, her eyes lingering on the small but growing confrontation, unnoticed by most. The red light on Kesler's body camera blinked steadily against his chest, silently recording every word, every movement. Kesler didn't acknowledge it. Or maybe he simply didn't care. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he said flatly, already expecting compliance as he took another step into Judge Hartwell's personal space. Judge Hartwell took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that steadied her before addressing a hostile witness on the stand. "I'm going to reach into my bag for my credentials," she said clearly, making sure every word carried. "I'm moving slowly, so there's no misunderstanding." She knelt slightly and unzipped the front pocket of her carry-on, her movements careful and precise, then withdrew a slim leather folder worn soft from years of use. Inside were documents that carried the full weight of federal authority, her judicial identification issued by the Administrative Office of the United States Courts, her state bar card from her years as a prosecutor, and her official travel itinerary confirming her role as keynote speaker at the National Judicial Conference in Chicago. She handed the folder to Officer Kesler. He glanced at the federal judicial ID for barely a few seconds, just long enough to register the photo and the seal before his interest evaporated. He flipped the bar card over once, as if checking a price tag, then let out a short, dismissive breath. Without reading further, he tossed the folder back toward her. It struck her chest and fell to the tile at her feet. "These could be fake," he said flatly. "Anyone can print stuff like this." Officer Stokes nodded along from behind him. "We see fake IDs all the time." A ripple of unease moved through the small crowd that had begun to form. A few more phones quietly raised, their lenses pointed in her direction. Judge Hartwell bent down slowly and picked up her credentials, brushing invisible dust from the leather cover. Her hands were steady, but her jaw tightened just enough to reveal the strain beneath her calm. "Officer," she said, looking directly at Kesler, "I am a sitting federal appeals court judge appointed by the President of the United States. You can verify my identity with one phone call to the U.S. Marshal's Service or the Fourth Circuit Clerk's Office." Kesler stepped closer, invading her space until she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I'll verify what I want to verify," he replied, his voice low and edged with irritation. "Now turn around." Kesler didn't step back after giving the order. He stepped forward again, close enough that Judge Hartwell could see the veins tightening along his neck, the flush of anger creeping up from beneath his collar. Whatever thin layer of professional restraint he had been holding onto was slipping, replaced by something sharper and more personal. Around them, the terminal felt smaller, the air heavier. Travelers had stopped pretending not to watch. A white businessman in a navy blazer stood frozen a few yards away, his rolling bag forgotten beside him. A young woman near the coffee kiosk had raised her phone higher, her hands trembling slightly as she recorded. "People like you," Kesler said quietly, his voice low but carrying just far enough for others to hear. "Think a fancy suit means you're above the law. Think you can walk through here like you own the place." Judge Hartwell met his stare without flinching. She had faced far more dangerous men in courtrooms and interrogation rooms. Men with nothing to lose. "I'd like your badge number," she said calmly, "and the name of your supervisor." Kesler didn't respond. He didn't acknowledge the request at all. Instead, his hand moved deliberately to his handcuffs. The metal made a soft, unmistakable click as his fingers wrapped around them. Officer Stokes shifted to the right, tightening the space, silently cutting off any path forward or back. His hand hovered near his own belt now, eyes darting between Judge Hartwell and the growing circle of onlookers. Kesler noticed the phones. "Put that away." He snapped toward the young woman recording. "This is official police business. You're interfering with an investigation." She hesitated, fear flickering across her face. But she didn't lower her phone. Kesler turned back to Judge Hartwell, his jaw clenched. "Patience gone. Last chance," he said. "Turn around. Now." Judge Hartwell's voice rose just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I am not resisting," she said slowly and clearly. "I am complying with your instructions, but I am also telling you, officer, that you are making a serious mistake. I am a federal judge. This will not end the way you think it will." Something in Kesler's expression shifted at those words, not toward restraint, but toward resolve, as if a line had been crossed and there was no turning back. The shift in Kesler's face was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes narrowed, his nostrils flared, and the last trace of restraint vanished. It was the look of a man who had never been challenged by someone he considered beneath him, and who refused to be corrected now. Without another word, he grabbed Judge Hartwell's right arm and wrenched it sharply behind her back. The movement was sudden and violent, and completely unnecessary. Before she could react, his other hand slammed into her upper back with full force. driving her forward and down. Judge Vivian Hartwell hit the terminal floor face first. The sound cut through the morning air like a gunshot. A dull crack followed by a collective gasp from the crowd. Her glasses flew from her face and skidded across the tile. One lens shattering into jagged pieces. Her carry-on tipped over, spilling open. Legal documents fanning out across the polished floor alongside a garment bag that burst apart. Her judicial robe sliding free like evidence at a crime scene. Officer Stokes reacted instantly, dropping his weight onto her back and driving his knee into the center of her spine. "Stop resisting," he shouted, his voice sharp and rehearsed. "Stop resisting," Kesler echoed, forcing her wrists together behind her. She was not resisting. She was 52 years old, weighed barely 140 pounds, and lay completely still. Stunned by the impact, her cheek pressed against the cold tile as blood began to trickle from a gash above her eyebrow, spreading slowly beneath her face. 6 civilian phones captured every second from different angles. 2 body cameras recorded the scene in brutal clarity, the red lights blinking silently as witnesses froze in disbelief. For a brief moment, the terminal fell into a stunned silence, as if no one could quite process what they were seeing. Then the reactions came all at once, sharp intakes of breath, muffled cries, angry shouts. Judge Hartwell said nothing. Not a word. Not a cry. Not a plea. She lay motionless on the floor, her silence heavy and deliberate, while the cameras recorded everything that would soon change every life involved. The silence shattered as voices erupted from the crowd all at once. "What are you doing?" someone shouted from behind the line of onlookers. A white businessman in a navy blazer stepped forward, his face pale with shock, pointing at the documents scattered across the floor. "That's a federal judge," he yelled. "She showed you her ID. You can't do this." A black woman standing near the coffee kiosk had her hand pressed over her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as she shook her head in disbelief, watching a nightmare unfold in real time. An elderly man wearing a worn Navy veteran's cap pushed through the edge of the crowd, his voice hoarse but steady. "You're assaulting her," he said. "She didn't do anything. I watched the whole thing. She was cooperating." Phones were raised higher now, lenses locked on the officers, capturing the blood on Judge Hartwell's face, the knee pressed into her back, the scattered robe on the floor. Kesler snapped his head toward the witnesses, fury flashing across his face. "Everyone back up," he barked. "This is a police matter. Clear the area now." No one moved. Stokes tightened his grip and pulled Judge Hartwell's wrists together, snapping the handcuffs shut with a cold metallic click. The sound echoed through the terminal, final and unmistakable. Her charcoal suit was torn at the shoulder, darkening where blood continued to drip from the gash above her eyebrow. Judge Hartwell remained silent, her face turned to the side against the tile, her breathing slow and controlled despite the pain. Years of experience had taught her this moment well. As a prosecutor, she had watched defendants destroy their own cases by talking. As a judge, she had seen truth survive not through argument, but through evidence. The body cameras, the phones, the witnesses now etched into memory. This was the record that would speak for her. And as the officers stood over her, convinced they were still in control, the truth was already slipping beyond their reach. Lieutenant Cheryl Davenport heard the commotion over her radio before she saw it, voices bleeding through the channel in overlapping bursts of urgency. Dispatch called it a disturbance near Gate 23, but the tone in the background told her it was something far worse. Raised voices, witnesses shouting, a word that made her stomach tighten injured. She moved quickly through the terminal, her boots striking the tile with purpose, one hand resting on her radio as instinct took over. In 16 years on the force, she had learned to recognize the sound of a situation already spiraling out of control. She arrived in under 4 minutes, and the scene stopped her cold. A black woman lay face down on the floor in handcuffs, blood streaking from a cut above her eye onto the polished tile. Papers were scattered everywhere. A garment bag lay open, a black judicial robe spilling across the floor like a silent accusation. A semicircle of angry travelers stood around the scene, phones raised, recording openly now. At the center of it all stood Officer Bryce Kesler, arms crossed, jaw set in defiance, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Nearby, Officer Stokes hovered nervously, his earlier confidence visibly shaken for the first time. "What happened here?" Davenport demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. Kesler answered immediately, without hesitation. "Suspicious individual," he said. She was evasive, became verbally aggressive, and resisted when I attempted to detain her. The words came out smoothly, practiced, as if he had rehearsed them long before this moment. Davenport didn't respond right away. Her eyes moved from Kesler to the woman on the ground, then to the crowd, and finally to a leather folder lying open near the judge's feet. She bent down and picked it up. Inside was a federal judicial identification card, now smudged with blood. The photograph matched the woman in cuffs. The name read clearly, Vivian Hartwell. The title beneath it left no room for interpretation. United States Circuit Judge, Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The color drained from Davenport's face so quickly it was impossible to miss. Her hand trembled as she closed the folder and looked back at Kesler. "Bryce," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know who this is?" For the first time since the confrontation began, something flickered in his eyes, not remorse, not regret, but doubt. And in that instant, Lieutenant Davenport knew this was no longer a scene she could contain. She turned away, raised her radio, and stepped into a private channel, already preparing to make the call that would change everything. Lieutenant Davenport's hand trembled slightly as she switched channels on her radio, lowering her voice as she stepped a few paces away from the crowd. "Captain Driscoll," she said, choosing her words carefully. "We have a situation at Gate 23. A detainee has been injured. She is identifying as a federal judge." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to register disbelief. Davenport glanced back at the scene, the blood, the cameras, the robe on the floor. "Correction," she added quietly. "She is a federal judge. I have her credentials in hand." The response came fast. Driscoll arrived within minutes, his face tightening the moment he saw the scene. He didn't ask questions. He didn't argue. He pulled out his phone and made his first call before he even reached the officers. That call went to the airport authority director. The director listened for less than 30 seconds before interrupting with a single, sharp question. A sitting federal judge. When Driscoll confirmed it, the director ended the call and immediately dialed the Department of Justice liaison assigned to the region. The DOJ liaison, a career attorney who had spent 15 years handling sensitive federal matters, didn't hesitate either. He made one call of his own. It went directly to the White House counsel's office. There were no dramatics, no raised voices, just a calm delivery of facts that carried enormous weight. A sitting federal appeals court judge had been assaulted and handcuffed by airport police while traveling on official judicial business. There was body camera footage, There were multiple civilian recordings. There were witnesses. 12 minutes. That was all it took, from the moment Judge Vivian Hartwell's face hit the terminal floor to the moment the White House was informed. By the time the sun had fully risen over Washington, this confirmed fact was already moving through the highest levels of the federal government. Orders began coming down almost immediately. Preserve all evidence. Secure all body camera footage. Separate the involved officers. This was no longer a local incident. And it was no longer subject to internal discretion. As agents and supervisors moved into position around Gate 23, one truth became clear to everyone watching. Whatever authority Officer Bryce Kesler thought he had that morning had just evaporated. And the consequences were about to arrive faster than anyone at Reagan National had ever seen. By mid-morning, Reagan National Airport no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a secured federal site. FBI agents arrived quietly, without sirens, flashing credentials instead of lights. Federal marshals moved with purpose, forming a protective perimeter around Judge Hartwell as paramedics treated the wound above her eyebrow and stabilized her before transport. Every body camera worn by airport police was seized on the spot. Radio logs were locked. Incident reports were frozen before a single line could be edited. This was no longer an internal review. It was evidence preservation for a federal investigation. Officer Bryce Kesler and Officer Danny Stokes were separated immediately and escorted to different rooms. Their badges were removed. Their weapons were taken from them without ceremony. Neither was told much. They didn't need to be. The shift in authority was unmistakable. Orders were no longer coming from supervisors they knew, but from federal agents who did not ask for explanations. They asked for facts. Within hours, FBI technicians pulled the body camera footage. Kesler's camera showed everything from the moment his eyes first settled on Judge Hartwell walking through the terminal. It captured her calm compliance, her clear identification of herself as a federal judge, the way she announced every movement before reaching for her credentials. It recorded him dismissing her judicial ID in seconds, throwing it back at her chest, and saying, "People like you think a fancy suit means you're above the law." Stokes's camera filled in the angles Kesler's missed, the positioning, the way he blocked her path. The instant he drove his knee into her back while shouting, "Stop resisting," at a woman lying motionless on the floor. That same footage was played less than 2 hours later in a secure conference room at the Department of Justice. Federal prosecutors watched in silence. No one interrupted. No one asked for context. The video provided all of it. When it ended, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then a senior civil rights prosecutor, a man with more than 20 years of experience, leaned back in his chair and spoke softly. "There's no ambiguity here," he said. "This is a textbook deprivation of rights under color of law." And with that assessment, the trajectory of the case was set. What had started as a single act of unchecked aggression at an airport gate had now become a full-scale federal prosecution. And it was moving forward with a speed and certainty that made one thing painfully clear. The system that had protected Bryce Kesler for 16 years had finally run out of places to hide. The investigation didn't stop with the footage. Federal agents widened the scope almost immediately, turning their attention from the incident to the man behind it. Within 48 hours, every complaint ever filed against Officer Bryce Kesler was pulled from storage and re-examined under federal scrutiny. 31 complaints spanning 14 years. Each one previously dismissed, now laid out side by side. When viewed together, the pattern was undeniable. Every complainant was Black or Latino. Every encounter began the same way: vague suspicion, a claimed match to a description, demands for identification followed by dismissal and escalation. Agents began reaching out to former complainants, people who had long ago given up on seeing accountability. 14 of them agreed to be re-interviewed. Their stories mirrored one another with chilling consistency. Unprovoked stops, fabricated justifications, threats of arrest, physical intimidation. In several cases, handcuffs. In 2, injuries that required hospital treatment. None of them had ever been charged with a crime. None of them had done anything wrong. What had once been brushed aside as isolated incidents now formed a clear and continuous pattern of civil rights abuse. Subpoenas followed. Internal emails and memoranda from the airport police department were pulled and reviewed. What investigators found was devastating. Supervisors had known about Kesler's behavior for years. Complaints had been discussed, flagged, and deliberately minimized. One email, sent 3 years earlier by a senior captain, cut through any remaining doubt. Kesler's aggressive. It read, but he gets results. The complaints are from the usual suspects. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. That phrase, the usual suspects, echoed through the investigation like a confession. The focus expanded again. This was no longer about one officer or even one partner. It was about a system that had enabled misconduct, ignored warning signs, and protected the wrong people at every level. As evidence stacked higher by the hour, federal prosecutors began preparing charges not just against Kesler and Stokes, but against the institutional failures that had allowed the abuse to continue unchecked for more than a decade. The question was no longer whether careers would end. It was how many. The consequences arrived with a speed that stunned everyone involved. 3 days after the assault, federal agents went to Bryce Kesler's home just after dawn. In front of his neighbors, the man who had spent 16 years believing himself untouchable was placed in handcuffs and led down his own driveway. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, assault of a federal official, and filing false reports. At his arraignment, prosecutors argued that his history showed a clear danger to the public. Bail was denied. Danny Stokes was arrested the same morning, charged with conspiracy and failure to intervene. His years of silent compliance had finally caught up with him. The fallout spread upward just as quickly. 3 supervisors were terminated within 2 weeks, including the captain who had dismissed complaints as coming from the usual suspects. The airport police chief resigned under pressure. The Department of Justice imposed a federal consent decree on the entire department, mandating outside oversight, new use of force policies, weekly body camera audits, and a complete overhaul of how complaints were handled. A structure that had protected abuse for over a decade collapsed in less than a month. 6 weeks after her face struck the terminal floor, Judge Vivian Hartwell returned to the bench. The cut above her eyebrow had healed into a thin scar she made no effort to conceal. She walked into her courtroom with the same quiet authority she had carried through the airport that morning. No speech, no statement, just the sound of the gavel as she called the first case. Weeks later, she delivered her postponed keynote address via video, speaking calmly about accountability, vigilance, and the obligation to confront injustice wherever it appears. Justice, she said, is not a guarantee. It is a responsibility. Judge Hartwell declined interviews, book deals, and public praise, but her case became a landmark all the same. It proved what happens when witnesses refuse to look away, when cameras record the truth, and when power is finally forced to answer to the law. On her desk, in a simple black frame, she kept one reminder from that morning: her shattered glasses, bent and incomplete. When asked about them, she always gave the same answer: They were there to remind her and anyone who saw them that justice can be broken in an instant. But when the truth is preserved, it can still be repaired.